Shalom, every one of you. How's your Sunday, the Lord's Day? I believe you had a wonderful time in the Lord. Today is Monday. From Monday to Friday, we will read some chapters of Second Chronicles with the theme, with the topic kings and king. The theme king is important because Jesus is our true king, and the Bible is Jesus' story and the king's story. When we read some books in the Bible about history, for example, First Samuel to Second Chronicles, when we do not have some knowledge about genealogy of kings, sometimes we have difficulty in understanding it. When you have some knowledge, I believe you will get more interested in these books. Let me start. The book of Judges, chapter 21, verse 25. This is the last verse of the book of Judges. Let me read. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Once again, in those days, Israel had no kings. Everyone did as he saw fit. They must have acted as God saw fit, but they acted as each of them saw fit. It means they didn't respect the words of God, and there were disorders in Israel because they didn't keep the words of God. When the leader of Israel after Moses, he was Joshua. In time of Joshua, they followed the words of God, but after Joshua died, there were many problems regarding their spiritual condition, and these sins and problems are shown in the book of Judges. God led out Israelites from Egypt, and he gave the promised land where inhabitants lived. Why did God drive out the inhabitants of the land Canaan? Is it just because God would give a good land to Israel? No. Actually, the region is inhabitants in Canaan. People in Canaan, their sins reached the heaven. The people in their land was so sinful, and the Bible says that's why the land would vomit them. Because of their sins, they were judged by God, and the land was occupied by Israel. And Israel conquered the land of Canaan, and unlike other countries, they didn't have a king. Precisely speaking, they always had a king who is God, and Israelites they wanted to have a king, like a king in other countries, who marched the army, who defeated the enemy. But the conception of king of Israel was very different from kings in other countries, because the king in Israel, kings should be like a mediator between God and people. Kings in other country, he tried to reign his country according to his own will, and also his own idea. But kings in Israel, they have to acknowledge the true King God, and they have to let the will of God fulfilled in their country. So it is a very great difference between kings in the world and the kings in Israel. And finally, we know God chose king in Israel. And first, handsome guy and tall, who is the first king? Saul was chosen as the first king. But after he became the king, his heart became arrogant, and he didn't respect the words of God, and he was dethroned. Actually, what I mean, he died in the battlefield, and it is in the will of God because of his arrogance. And the second king, who is the second king? David. David was faithful to the Lord. He really loved God. But he was not also in perfect in what he did. We all know David's great sin. He loved one woman who was a wife of one man, his servant Uriah, and he did adultery and murder. But David repented of his sins, and David, generally speaking, we can say David was faithful in following the words of God. So from David, we have good some conception about kings of Israel, the roles of Israel. And who was the next king after David? He is the son of David, Solomon. His mother was Bathsheba. In Solomon's time, Israelites enjoyed peace and had abundant material. And there's a great and amazing event in Solomon's time, right? What is it? The temple of the Lord was built. Now, David had a palace, right? And the temple of the Lord was, in my opinion, true palace, because in the temple of the Lord there was the presence of God, who is a true king. It is a wonderful and beautiful temple. But sorrowfully, in the late days of Solomon, he had many wives from foreign country, and his wives served. Many of his wives served the idols, and Solomon also followed the idolatry, and he committed sins. And after the Solomon, Israel was divided into two countries. northern Israel and south Judah. Like Korea. Korea was one country, but after the Second World War, it were divided into two countries. And we see many kings in Israel and also kings in South Judah. But in Israel, most of kings were evil. They didn't respect the words of God. They committed great sins. But in the south of Judah, we see many many kings who respected the words of God, who would display the justice of God to people. And especially in the south of Judah, the lineage of king is continued. What I mean, David's seed is thrown continuously, unlike North Israel. And we also know God showed mercy to both the countries, but sorrowfully, the two countries failed, and they were destroyed by other countries. North Israel was defeated by Assyria, and South Judah by Babylon, because they abandoned God, and God also abandoned them. But we know that God didn't give up his covenant with Abraham and David. God told Abraham, all people will be blessed through Abraham. And God said, the nation, the country of David stands forever. Actually, what the what it means is the King Jesus, the King Jesus. The kingdom of David ultimately is pointing to the true King Jesus Christ, our Lord. Judah fell by other country, but the lineage of King of David is continued to Jesus. And in further study this week, we will have some ideas or outlines about the king and kings. I hope we may have a wonderful time with it. God bless you.